Describing now is interactions. Scales can be large and so very species. Specific, interspecific interaction. And likely points because what you respect from the interaction, right? And what circumstances you look at how you apply other words, what we are talking about is selection equals species. More that's ultimate conversion between two species. So, can during the refinement point of view, reciprocity genetic selection between some. So, all this emphasis change. So magic results ultimately accompany the swapping. That is an interaction. And something in the mind change. something very, very well innovative thing that we call therapy from spring. It's an interaction, it's a change, and what we're talking about is one organism making selective agent for this interaction. So what we say this invention is what is it find out? We say the environment, we think of the environment only anywhere in the country. Right? This is simple. But what is the real environment as far as occupations as far as biology is concerned? The environment is both biology and embryonic component. Right? So now when we're talking about co-evolution, we are talking mainly about one part of the environment being a biologic component. That is exactly the same question. And I return to another species. That species is exactly some selection from their brain. Second person from one species. So this becomes a co-evolutionary integration. So that's why ecosystem comes in. Now, what does work in the case of co-evolution? It's survival based on times if you have something against people, so we already discussed exactly except this is something I think most of us like. What we do in this session is to take out some examples and try to dissect down different components of it and try to discuss each component can be studied. So this is exact related correlation to any biologist, but how much time do we have the traditional biologists studying it? How we design experiments? And try to give us some examples of looking at this. So, what kind of interactions can you have between two species? You can, this is a tiny brain, you have that effect on the interaction with one species. So, let's say two species, if the interaction affects another significantly, what would be a significant effect in terms of durability? In terms of radiation, fitness, evolution, if this interaction results in reduced fitness to one species, it's negative effect. So, it doesn't matter if I make us plant and drop it and so on. Some markets have major markets, some not. If it's able to retain fitness, it's different. All that matters in evolution is a very important component is selection. Selection acts on variation. So, you can think of this effect. So, fitness is not affected later species, but sometimes this kind of interaction is called out in the form of interaction experts. So, we have one species positively affected which happens coincidence one is likely to water traditional human parasitism also. One comes positive effect and the other is negative effect. each of these interactions here is co-evolutionary, is a potential co-evolutionary logic. Prediction goes this way, competition obeys law, nature doesn't. Yes, what would be this? To give you an example of a theory, molecules and atoms. You look at a lot of examples, but here what's happening? One of them is benefiting. One of them is not benefiting or good. So this species here can excite us physically, but you can. This species can excite us physically. As far as this particular interaction is concerned, this is another we just talking about this interaction. So basically, whenever you have these zeros, effectively at least one is speaking that interaction between that species is not sometimes those are referred to as true ideas. It makes terms here, these terms here, understand here, I'm not really all of them or to, but what matters is effective purpose. According to this, both parties have some should let's say the most straightforward or let's say not most straightforward, something that is important. Sometimes it can be done adaptation. So in this case, it's a result of natural interactions where species have some traits and some adaptations which give them in this interaction and in this interaction the fitness famous example, I mentioned naturalism. For example, still difference is a great some feeling quite humans, living complex, which is forgotten by ants. Difference what the ethics did now when I can find out what is the benefit of difference. Connection happens. So look at this. So this is what I say. So we can ask the question how does naturalism arise? And before that, there is first we should establish my own business. So you see, I stated something interesting in the interaction. So what are the necessary things in order to be able to say confidently that we have collaboration? The first thing I can establish is the interaction. So what do we need to go to be able to establish an interaction between two species? Let's talk about one of the parties taking on the so before that, we have the same interaction, we are saying that people are something that happens consistently. It's possible that this and occasionally often combined with some of the mass species in the photos of the interaction, let's say they observe that eyes are feeling from benefits and you see this happening in different ways and the numbers are growing at much better. So let's say now we're happy to see the next step. What would I want? The next step is to go as hard as seriously. It's very much for me. But this is what the community is about, right? So people who will just discuss something how we are going to do follow experiments. Experiments where parents are involved and they are not. So when you open potentials, parents so what are they doing? They are jointly measuring fitness here. Measuring so measuring fitness is about is it possible to measure fitness? How is how to measure fitness? Fitness is measuring fitness. So like some kind of survey was a process on but a lot of information parents do. And fitness is something what is fitness? Let's go back. What is fitness? You discuss something before you can in the structure. So maybe we'll take a detour and reflect what fitness is. So what is fitness? Ability to pass a little material into the next generation. Okay? Any other thoughts, reflections? Either surviving themselves to the next. So what is the number of surviving speed? The wisdom is called fecundity. Fecundity is the number of speed. So fecundity is one given feature is one number of fitness. But what really matters is how many of them survive to undergo how many of them speed and how many of these will not reproduce. Okay, I think we need to think about these long reproduce that they need to have the next generation so what they are talking about is in my opinion, one way to look at fitness is further fitness is in a sense the compartmentalized survival. Survive across across time. So take one survival. But reproduction was not going to has offspring, but you need to take a mother in this is going to somewhere within children. So what plants, it's things like generation percentage. So what is the generation percentage? It's when people die. Or saving objects. So it depends on lifespan. If you must be on the something. Measure living. Unless it's the offspring, you don't do it. Depending on the complexity of the how much resources you have. So how do you take spaces? You would want to make under all the sets, generate and become easier so that you can have seeds from the particular tree. But except some positive is very similar. So you have to design some experiments well. You are not going to measure some chemicals from it. And then for instance, if you go to manage what you do, for instance, if you have prediction rates, people have models. Also, the art is making something creative. So I think all chemical composition of it, and if it is true, it will actually replicate something or you want to do something useful and something as a situation. And if it is not present, not you will again. And then the art is getting the meaning from the input. So you give it that, and then you find something source or you manipulate the composition of that source or whatever, and then see whether it's working. What would be the most interesting to be done? What does a food have to recognize? I have to say, like, from the start, if I know all these methods, then maybe I can population of certain number, and after a certain time, if my population is reducing, they are going somewhere for nutrition or something, then definitely there are some positive effects from those methods. So you have compared the population sizes of animals. And even if they are not going away, if the physical fitness is reducing. Physical fitness, I don't know what the physical again, then you have to measure the survival. Maybe when there is a fate, then they are surviving for long time, and when there is no, then they are surviving for like 6 months. What is the most drastic effect you can have on them? What cannot survive? They may completely die to the that's the most drastic effect. So if you look at last drastic effects, let's say these plants can still survive on this planet for 24 months. And there might be some other effects. You would want to find out what exactly is the effects of. So, we measure growth rates, for example, we measure the size of the mass. So, body size is something that is important because the SR can be very small. Drawing essentially. You cannot think of various different experiments. And for each one, you can notice exactly what is it, what's the and how we are going to do this, and so we two types of interactions, especially in relation to the principle, you will change. So you can have a facultative interaction, or it can be obligated. So another reason that you would actually discuss that when we said that ads can survive for the efforts, then it's obligated. It's a company that my definition is a facultative. Assuming it's facultative, what things we can do to estimate is so these are discussed. How long it takes to mature, typical of flexibility of labs, and tricky because you can't do that. It's common. You can't do it in usual units. The lab doesn't like that. Fitness is like common. That's a big issue. It's not going to be something tricky. So we're operating under the assumption that when there's selection on a particular trait, the variation is selection over particular trait. Very generally speaking, that's true. So now you tell me, what is a trait for? The answer to your question is easy. It depends on how you define a trait and what it's going to be. In this case, you could look at the additive quantity of additive substances. So let's assume that every time able to survive the model for cell generation is predation involves some extent of your generations of the population continues. You would expect that it is one and a half time. What do I expect in terms of what you expect that what is discussed? What I expect. We understand. You do this experiment first where test whether liquids consumption not yes, we find that if it is a patented consumption, so even when say for the formulated example, you will find that the difference in how you adjust it. In the plant, we already have eyes, and the difference is the difference we don't have it, so the difference are not active in the sense that they are not, the entire design better not to produce this, but they cannot display value for the answer that so now you found out that the difference curves are getting over and the setup is actually okay. You know, do it others as well. What do you expect to happen to other so when there is no end, then the amount of native I think it will reduce because to produce it they need to invest some amount of energy and when they are not getting any benefit of that energy they like it should the selection should go for saving that energy. selected to survive the bomb. Let's say you're giving artificial and protective weapons from prevention. Or you can have another selection time where you just manually remove bombs, but there is prediction of speed. So what would happen to manual bombs in these scenarios? It's maybe because it's mostly processing instead they might invest their energy in the policy. So in this case, if you remove the lines, first of all, you're saying you're changing the production for a very long time. This is like a thought experiment, right? This they consider one thing very hardly, and you say now reduction in energy production. One thing is also you include the environment that you count. That's where I have felt in this case, right? Scissors and scissors clear has some cost benefit reduction. It's unlikely. And they say there's no cost due to not doing this. Right? If the websites are nice, and let's say you're protecting them, there's no predation. If you see how fitness difference between defense using anemia versus president in that condition, if you see no fitness difference, that means that the anemia production the toxins, what you call accumulation interaction. It's an interaction production. Like, it's like an adaptation. What is an adaptation? Actually, it affects adaptation is nothing but the outcome of selection. Selection was happened in the past. Some traits have been selected. Those are what we call adaptation speed. So, in one case, X, 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 there is a certain condition that I didn't know when I was adaptation was adaptation as evolution is progressed. People have been less trying to say people don't have so in this case, we are implicitly assuming that that's a fitness test. Not what you think. Without that implicit assumption, you can't really talk about it. What do you present that energy cost? Because the specialist state contains the functions and so on. But doesn't mean that native production involves if it's social, it's first social, social, not social. Those things like the mindset of and what are the questions? Can you conclude that how do you avoid the attack on this? See this sounds really nice. initially when we realize that we are exploiting wastes more than we do. So it's possible that through this waste they could be and started feeding on them. And once this association started, it's possible that it was direct from selection to make this better to other hands to strengthen this association. So we don't really know. Also, we design some experiments to analyze certain aspects of this interaction, but not everything will be possible to experiment with. There was something we can do. So what about philosophy? How can you species specialize in human people species? Then I talk about that. They discuss that. The analysis study is actually a thought experiment that involved, you say, thousands of generations. Do the find that the line of action doesn't fully connect. Then it is good for evaluating the current production people doesn't change the business cost. Okay? Whereas maybe not have evolved as it is. It will not be necessarily linear thought and it may have some reflection or it has to background. Just then. Today, the gestalt is just a kind of representation. So, what about simultaneously looking at different trends? I think if you do that in this trend, so it depends on all the trend. Here, hunting itself, composition, different you might find it less natural line. The content does not change, but the composition might change. Just excluding the rest, for example, matter that you don't want to explain to that as well. Strengthen this. The content strengthens the selection has been made for selection increase. It's positive without variation like this. It's positive. Associated with some use some growth of the plants. So the plants is a material associated same plans as in place. So you know that the long term results. Mental feeling. If you think of what might be scenarios in the past, what are the steps in advance to start the production? You must have anything. This is again, so for them, a lot of people use challenges as an employee. Systematic environment. So then, challenges is hypothesis testing. You can have hypothesis of the direction of the information and you can also really test as hypothesis. You can come with some hypothesis on the direction of the information, which we can eventually test with a basic function. Transition, let's say, presence and absence of there's a transition from absence to presence of so this is really a very bad job. The number of transitions from one behavior to behavior should be correlated with the role is flagged as a transition in terms of and association. So that if I find out later, could possibly have basically some liquid segregation. Right? So maybe there's a light hospital witness secret some liquids. And then at some point, and association level, later at some point, the behavior of those two change. One potential factor. The one thing is the case in this case, I guess, there is positive think about RFP and explore the test hypothesis. Similarly for ants, we might predict the set of transitions from one phase to another. What we might say here is it's more of a comparative some transition rate system. That's not very important. But this probably tells the direction of being built on the set of hypotheses. One of which are related to some things that we have discussed in the course. One because of the so, okay, this is another way of doing this experiment. So, one way to do experiments is to control conditions with a laboratory field conditions where you take multiple input treatments, experimental populations where very less part presence of those in physical something. That's one way to do it. But another way to do it is a comparative. You can take a bunch of species which you know a particular trait, and another bunch of species which don't have this trait. And then you also have to control for comparative. So this is quite important. what you could do is what you're going on, you could get if you miss something like that. So that's what this answer takes of the reference. Or what you do is you could take one of these and artificially create a patient who becomes something. Let's say this case scenarios in confidence and you always confirm the truth that you have to different replace on something else. The other way to do it is to take a bunch of species and look at what are these trait counts. You can take all the names for instance. You can take human names. You can look at the average something once. It depends on the particular activity of the trait counts are. Another way of objective experiment. But in this case, you also have to take into account you also have to take into account because let's say in this plate here, we have data from two species. You might think that we have two data points. I say data points because within this you have duplicates and so on. But you have two values of the species. But these are not related to the activity. The trait will have to be here. So you are just getting pseudo attributes because of which you have to take into account all the things to the character experiment. You have this plate here which is naturalistic with eyes. You have another plate outside here which is not, let's call it not essentially eyes. Let's not define it with the okay. So let's say that all of those which are related to the other the other ones will have something to the other ones like science and we may be very much but still I think this is interesting and it's good to discuss these things. So what you are asking is simple. Okay, let's see. We'll try to define this. All these species have trade. All these species trade. Okay? All these species are something in common. All these have something in common. Because right now, it's very similar. It's very similar. When you control that, whatever you control of yourself is because of this trait. You cannot do it because this trait here, when you record this in one state, that's why I have recorded one state. So essentially, what you have here is one sample of you, one sample of you. And you have a problem with small samples in this experiment. Right? So that was one way the problem of experiment to make another example. So in this case, you are not able to include the very together. Right? Whereas in this case, what you have here is multiple comparisons. One here, here. If this is P, obviously you have one here and you have one here. Multiple models and multiple cases. Obviously, the more system as you have, the stronger you have conclusion. understanding of mental status is essentially controlling the analysis. To the same question, the same traits, you can make adjustments in many different ways. So one of this particular example, I just looking at context, but an real world real context in these traits, which learning applies in various different ways. An example is insect pollinator relations. What are these things that we can feel about? Here's another example. You another straightforward example. If you guys benefit to the analysis, it is protection from you. That's from the physical example, the one from competitors from profitability. For the plant itself, several experiments have been done where they show the presence of ants, reduces in this perspective of the human. So on the surface, it seems like a very simple, straightforward, mechanistic coordination. But even this actually, go back to if you try to dissect each of these things, these ants here, not as divided by noise and other classification. You can do this instead of another differentiation plants. You see all the but you have to trace the steps in the initially they might be doing something else. But it's possible that some point of time plants created other incidents and started to have a difference. One of the things, the last thing countries because for all of them it can design experiments to see the effect of because this is so you're asking the question if plants develop a different form, let's not talk about quantity. So let's say plants have a different form, therefore they produce signal. Because of this, we think this transition what I say is, I want orphans to be much because orphans are very agitated. It can't just be one book. The species first one variation, selection has to favor certain variations. So there is directional selection quite likely to one of the variations not as detailed observation of children from school. But it's unlikely that all will develop some influence which is really not very important. Right? This applies not only to individuals, it applies to a lot of things in selection. So you have to ask this question. You have to ask this question. See, for orphans, it's very likely that the production of living has a fixed cost. So what happens if it's start significantly less of this? You have to ask that question. If it's producing less and less, there is a point where ants may not stick to this, they might move into other active population, move into other active species, they might go to other active populations which are producing then what will happen is ants will they have another fitness cost. So producing honeydew itself is a fitness cost. And now they will maximize the fitness by producing as many honeydew as possible. But at some point, producing less honeydew is going to drive away the ants. Then there's a strong fitness cost. There's a trade-off. So ants stabilize probably something like that. It can also be some cost. It's all about cost to the as long as that equal relation to cost to the least equal to that. That's another very good interpretation. Infants are not producing honey, the ants might kill them. That's very like it happens in all of the children. In some cases, so in that case, there's a very strong direct fitness cost to the consuming more at least animal particles don't in that today's thinking for selection is acting in many different ways. There is some equality because it stabilizes. Right? Is it very fitness cost? That is a strong than others. So if the hands are not well for the difference, what is the fitness cost of women? And for the arms, what is the fitness cost of feeding out small hands, small hands? So there are two different things. So sometimes it's going to study. Ultimately, this what you're calling as the still the structure is related to fitness cost. Based on that, it has difference. And we could take a graph what the drug for defect fitness with respect to job exercise. And high fitness with respect to good job competency rate the size. In fact, we could do experiments to test with that is to find out the impact of curves and see whether as is to this is equal to or this is actually not observed. Regarding your point about points being monitoring, I don't know if it works because these are extreme. I think these are computers. But we use like video materials. I don't know if I'm looking at the I don't know if it's something about yes, it was looking about this. But I mean, if you want to know this, I can come to for because exactly this because we have so many experiences and ideas with the kind of mediums with this. And the gist of it is that the female after mating usually will form circle has multiple organs inside. So the female after mating with the male it comes up and takes its form in many species. The female can't come up by itself. The other males do the male now moving to mate in many species. So it's very interesting. They come out and they sense which foods and rapid effects as well. Because the female that usually likes the food which is already the most effective and first so if fruit already has many things and many developing value, then there's no point in doing more than the female is able to catch which ones are already it's already female person and the female person it uses its wings. So because this is relatively very small hole and must do it has to exist outside the surface. And in fact, studies have shown that the females are able to come up only wings and then just others that they are able to extend are insects and very common material. Female look at every single aspect of this interaction. Okay? So, for example, there are some so there's diversity of flaws. Unfortunately, his longer studies, never want to get only not which have shorter studies, rather long desire that they will use. So who decides what proportion become knowledge whether what proportion becomes this or what proportion becomes this? You have to calculate the things that it's a plant which decides. Of course, ultimately it's a plant which has the genes and so on will control. But the selection pressure on the plants to have enough of the have enough of these smaller ones. See, for the plant, this is mostly waste. This condition is not very effective. There is no added value because it's just going to become a norm and it's going to utilize the other waste. The plant, all that matters is this. Ideally, the plant would want the plant's fitness would be greatest when it has only these kinds of things and the wasps are coming in and they pollinate only the time. That's what the plants would be selecting food. And the wasps select the food. They select the food for actually unless they're getting any nutrition from this pond and so on. They have selected the when they are selected to prefer flowers or fruits which have a large proportion of these nutrients. Okay? So a selection going on people have figured out that with certain circumstances, some populations have a higher proportion of this, some populations have a higher proportion of this. And it's dynamic. It's not that the equilibrium that is between one and stabilized. Different populations allow different stages allow this equilibrium. It probably oscillates proportionally. Smaller flowers probably oscillates but every other thing, every single thing you think about, the ways, they must have responsibility in many ways. So because the job, the bees are not common unless in some species the male has a job of making honey. Then the males are not coming out without a touch of them. So the males are involved with a suite of characteristics which the multiple males do this thing. The multiple males do not males make it. This case it's not a social community. As a by doing the it's to plan on that. Right? In fact, if you think about it, it's surprising that so many insects male survive for so many longer. In microfills and some spiders, after eating the male is eaten up by them. And I'm so surprised that this is not important in other insects. It's one of the millions of insects in which the males continue to survive really the female community, insects by the female community for them males. Why is it not equal in both times? It doesn't happen in all spaces. It doesn't happen in all spaces. The fact that this female community doesn't want seems the fact that this is not allowed in so many other species seems like a sensible thing to do. Like in planetary insects, for example. It's not the case in vertebrates. is really fast everything and just flies away. But that's open again, vertical interactive track. So that the same cannot go on anywhere. The very species is happens. So from the race perspective, we expect to escape and not to make. From the race perspective, the man should make it. Given this truth, then why is it that we have such an asymmetry? Why the males are divided from the countries? Sometimes this intersectional movement is part of a very, very fascinating thing. Some of the driven structure of the brain are so mental problem of the brain is where everything happens at this going and they come to the record and they use that what we are seeing is that the trait of stimulating the brain can be also passed on to the brain is level have a what we're saying is that brains are not single humans. Brains are possibly more. That's what I think Solomon and Brian said. Males typically away from the time. Polyandry is right to me. So males will make this relationship with them as soon as they leave, they just fly away from the that's not the way it is passing an explanation. We're talking of so many millions of species. Given this, I'm just a curiosity to know that it's going to happen. We have so and a system that was inherent with such a hard expected defense. It's one of the there has to be a bunch of investment ratings that to evolve. The state of things it's very complex. This is again referring to rights not having this interesting thing, but several areas remain static. Several areas remain working. There's so many small interactions. The paper is one large naturalistic interaction. One effectively it's a bunch of many, many different spectrum functions that are covering together after you can't design an experiment, you can't every single component to make it data. And of course, one particular financially, this one. So you can tell you this thing was a start interaction where, okay, why is this important? It's not a start a pattern interaction. Not one of them. Why is it supposed to be so important? You won't depend on each other for several years. It's the same because you have to depend on in other words, if this was first the coordinate some other fixed species, why is it the less solution? If this was mistaken coordinate from some species and it's going to some other species, that will not work for the okay, so now you're talking fidelity, species fidelity in terms of human transfer. This is a general thing in all formal coordinates. There is this thing where, for example, heaviness, you tend to visit the same species multiple times. Last time the only was the selection code. So, I would ask you this last time. Why do you have such a tight interaction? Why most species is known to pollinate multiple species? One species was pollinated by multiple species. Why does it want more species? Well, you can have multiple populations of course. Pollinates as well as pollinates. Actually, what you're saying is that if we are carbon pollination technology, horticulture science uses these structures that make the eggs. They might be different in different things. The only reason is that this restaurant here, the size of the restaurant differs across different things species. Essentially, that's one reason why there is a tight relationship. You can even ask this question, why does a small constant going to a smaller constant? So, this computation made the constant species, the larger species will be better off in computation inside some correlate smaller species. But there are some examples where multiple species dominate the same species. But very generally speaking, it's a morphological cycle. It's starting with some kind of loss locating the density there. Only particular one species will become successful and let's take a